I never believed in the paranormal until I moved into that Victorian house on Elm Street. It was 2018, and I had just graduated from college, eager to start my new job in a small town in Massachusetts. The rent was suspiciously cheap for such a beautiful old house, but the landlord, Mrs. Henderson, explained that it had been on the market for months. "People just don't appreciate classic architecture anymore," she said with a nervous laugh. The house was built in 1887, with high ceilings, ornate moldings, and creaky hardwood floors that seemed to groan with every step. My bedroom was on the second floor, overlooking the street through tall, narrow windows with heavy curtains that the previous tenant had left behind. Everything seemed perfect for the first few weeks. The incident started small. I would come home to find doors I was certain I had closed standing wide open. Kitchen cabinets would be ajar in the morning, though I distinctly remembered shutting them the night before. I blamed it on the old house settling, or perhaps my own forgetfulness as I adjusted to my new routine. But then came the footsteps. Every night at exactly 3:17 a.m., I would wake to the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. They would start at the top of the stairs and move methodically down the hall, pausing directly outside my door for what felt like an eternity before continuing to the end of the hallway. The first few times, I convinced myself it was the house settling or perhaps a neighbor's footsteps from the adjacent building. I decided to investigate. On the fourth night, I positioned myself by the door with my phone's flashlight ready. At 3:17 a.m. sharp, the footsteps began. My heart pounded as I slowly turned the doorknob and peered into the hallway. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing absolutely nothing. Yet the footsteps continued, now seeming to come from directly in front of me. I could hear the floorboards creaking under invisible weight, moving past me toward the end of the hall. I followed the sound, my bare feet silent on the cold hardwood. The footsteps stopped at the last door, a room I had never opened because Mrs. Henderson had said it was just storage space and the key had been lost years ago. As I stood there in the darkness, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The distinct sound of that door opening. The next morning, I called Mrs. Henderson about the locked room. There was a long pause before she spoke. "I suppose you have a right to know," she said finally. "That room belonged to Margaret Whitmore. She lived in that house for 60 years, until she passed away in her sleep in 1995. The family who bought the house after her death had that room locked up, they said. They said Margaret never really left." Mrs. Henderson agreed to bring me the spare key she had forgotten about. When she arrived that afternoon, her hands were trembling as she handed it to me. Margaret was a lovely woman, but she was very particular about her routines. Every night at 3:17, she would make her rounds, checking all the doors and windows before returning to her room. Some habits, I suppose, are hard to break. That evening, I stood outside Margaret's room with the key in my hand. The metal was ice cold despite the warm autumn weather. As I turned the key and pushed open the door, the smell hit me immediately, lavender and mothballs, with an underlying mustiness of decades-old fabric. The room was exactly as Margaret had left it in 1995. A four-poster bed dominated the space, its white lace coverlet still perfectly made. Antique furniture filled every corner. A vanity with an ornate mirror, a rocking chair positioned by the window, and a wardrobe that seemed to loom in the shadows. But what caught my attention was the trail of dust disturbed on the floor, leading from the door to the bed and back again, footprints, made recently and repeatedly. I was about to leave when I noticed something on the vanity. Among Margaret's vintage perfume bottles and jewelry boxes was a leather-bound journal, open to an entry dated October 15, 1995, just days before her death. In spidery handwriting, she had written, "I know my time is coming soon. I've lived in this house for so long, I cannot imagine existing anywhere else. If there is a way to stay, to continue watching over my beloved home, I pray I will find it." That night, I left Margaret's door open. At 3:17 a.m., I listened as the footsteps made their usual journey down the hall, but this time they didn't pause outside my door. They went directly to Margaret's room. From my bed, I could hear the creaking of floorboards, the soft sound of dresser drawers being opened and closed, and what sounded like someone settling into the rocking chair by the window. I lived in that house for 2 more years, and Margaret's nightly rounds never stopped. But I no longer feared them. I had come to understand that I wasn't living alone. I was sharing the house with someone who loved it as much as I did. Sometimes, on particularly difficult days, I would find small comforts waiting for me. a cup of tea that was still warm when I came home from work, or my favorite book moved to a more convenient location. The morning I moved out, I left a note on Margaret's vanity, thanking her for being such a considerate housemate. When I returned later that day to retrieve a forgotten item, the note was gone, but in its place was a single white rose from the garden, outside a rose that shouldn't have been blooming in December. I never told my friends the real reason I moved out of that beautiful Victorian house. How could I explain that I left not out of fear, but out of respect? Margaret had been there first, and that house would always be hers. Some presences, I learned, are not hauntings, but homecomings. I've always considered myself a rational person, someone who believes in science and logic over superstition and folklore. That confidence was shattered during a camping trip in the Pacific Northwest in the summer of 2019. What I experienced in those ancient woods challenged everything I thought I knew about the world. My college roommate Jake and I had planned a week-long hiking and camping expedition in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State. We were experienced backpackers, having spent countless weekends exploring trails throughout New England during our university years. This trip was meant to be our celebration of landing our first real jobs, a last adventure before settling into adult responsibilities. We chose a remote area known for its pristine wilderness and minimal human traffic. The trail we selected would take us deep into old-growth forest, where some trees had been standing for over 1,000 years. The park ranger who issued our permits mentioned that we were only the third group to request access to that particular section of the forest that entire summer. The first 2 days were perfect. We hiked through stunning landscapes, photographed wildlife, and felt that deep connection to nature that only comes from being truly isolated from civilization. Our campsite on the second night was in a small clearing beside a crystal-clear stream, surrounded by towering Douglas firs and western red cedars that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the sky. It was on the third night that everything changed. I was awakened around 2 a.m. by a sound I had never heard before, a low, guttural vocalization that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the forest. It wasn't quite an animal call, but it wasn't human either. The sound sent an immediate chill down my spine, triggering some primal fear response that bypassed my rational mind entirely. Jake was already sitting up in his sleeping bag, his eyes wide with the same confusion and terror I felt. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Before I could respond, the sound came again. Closer this time, it was a series of long, mournful calls that seemed to echo through the forest, bouncing off the ancient trees and creating an otherworldly chorus. But what made it truly terrifying was the intelligence behind it. This wasn't just random animal noise. There was a pattern, a purposefulness that suggested communication. We grabbed our flashlights and unzipped our tent just enough to peer outside. The clearing that had seemed so peaceful during the day now felt ominous and exposed. The beam of my flashlight couldn't penetrate far into the dense forest, creating pockets of impenetrable darkness between the massive tree trunks. The calls continued for another 10 minutes, sometimes seeming to come from our left, sometimes from our right, as if whatever was making them was moving in a circle around our campsite. Then, abruptly, everything went silent. Not just the calling, but all sound: no insects chirping, no wind rustling through the leaves, no water babbling in the nearby stream. The forest had become a vacuum of absolute quiet. That's when we saw the eyes. About 50 yards from our tent, at the edge of the clearing, two large, reflective eyes stared at us from behind a massive cedar tree. They were too high off the ground to belong to any known animal in the area, at least 8 feet up, and they had an unsettling quality of intelligence, as if whatever owned them was studying us with the same intense curiosity we felt looking back. Jay grabbed my arm. "We need to leave. Now." But as we started to pack our gear, the eyes disappeared, and the forest sounds gradually returned to normal. By morning, I had almost convinced myself that we had experienced some kind of shared hallucination brought on by the isolation and the strange acoustics of the forest. That rationalization lasted until we found the footprints. In the soft earth around our campsite were tracks unlike anything I had ever seen. They were roughly humanoid, but much larger than human feet, at least 18 inches long and 8 inches wide. The impressions were deep, suggesting something that weighed far more than a person. But most disturbing was the stride length, nearly 6 feet between prints, indicating a creature with impossibly long legs or the ability to cover ground in ways that defied normal locomotion. The tracks formed a perfect circle around our tent, exactly as we had suspected from the movement of the calls the night before. Whatever had been watching us had been close enough to touch our tent, yet we had never heard it approaching or leaving. We followed the tracks as they led away from our campsite and deeper into the forest. After about a quarter mile, they simply vanished. Not at a rock formation or stream where they might have been obscured. They just stopped in the middle of a game trail, as if whatever made them had simply ceased to exist at that point. The remainder of our trip was spent in a state of constant unease. We found more evidence of the creature's presence. Trees with bark scraped off at heights no known animal could reach. Strange arrangements of rocks and branches that seemed too deliberate to be natural, and an overwhelming sense of being watched whenever we ventured away from our tent. On our final night, I was awakened again by sound. But this time, it was different. Instead of the guttural calls, I heard what sounded distinctly like human speech, but spoken in a language I didn't recognize, with inflections and cadences that seemed somehow wrong for human vocal cords. The voice was deep and resonant, carrying easily through the forest despite seeming to come from a great distance. I lay in my sleeping bag, paralyzed by fear, as the voice continued for what felt like hours. Sometimes it seemed to be addressing us directly. Other times it sounded like part of a conversation with other unseen entities. Jake later told me he heard it too, but we never discussed what we thought it might have been saying. When we finally hiked out of the forest 2 days later, we were different people. The experience had shaken something fundamental in both of us. We had encountered something that existed outside the boundaries of accepted science and rational explanation. I spent months researching our experience, reading accounts from other hikers and campers who had reported similar encounters in the Pacific Northwest. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. The calls, the eyes, the footprints, the sense of intelligence behind it all. The local indigenous tribes had stories going back generations about forest beings they called the Stick Indians, entities that existed in the liminal space between the human and animal worlds. I never went back to that forest, though I often think about what we encountered there. Some experiences change you permanently, creating cracks in your certainty about the world that can never be fully repaired. I know there are things in this world that science cannot yet explain, beings that exist beyond the margins of human understanding. That knowledge is both humbling and terrifying. It reminds me that for all our technological advancement and scientific progress, we are still small creatures in a vast and mysterious world, sharing space with entities we may never fully comprehend. Real estate has always been in my family. My father was an agent, my grandfather before him, and when I graduated with a business degree in 2020, it seemed natural that I would continue the tradition. I thought I had seen every type of property challenge, from foundation issues to previous owners who were less than forthcoming about problems. Nothing, however, prepared me for the house at 1247 Sycamore Drive. The Victorian mansion had been on the market for over 3 years when I inherited the listing from a retiring agent. Built in 1902 by railroad magnate Edmund Blackwood, it was an architectural masterpiece that should have sold within weeks. Instead, it had gone through 17 different real estate agents, countless price reductions, and dozens of potential buyers who would tour the property once and never return. The house was undeniably beautiful, 3 stories of pristine craftsmanship, with original hardwood floors, hand-carved banisters, and stained glass windows that cast rainbow patterns across the walls when the afternoon sun hit them just right. The asking price had dropped from $2.8 million to $750,000. Zero a steal for a property of that size and historical significance. My first walkthrough should have been routine. I arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, armed with my camera, measuring tape, and standard inspection checklist. The current owners, the Hendricks family, had moved out 6 months earlier, but maintained the utilities for showings. Mrs. Hendricks met me at the front door, her nervousness immediately apparent. "I hope you have better luck than the others," she said, handing me the keys with trembling hands. "This house, it has a way of making people uncomfortable." I assured her that I specialized in challenging properties and began my tour. The main floor was stunning, a grand foyer with a crystal chandelier, formal dining room with original wallpaper, and a library lined with built-in bookcases that stretched from floor to ceiling. Everything was immaculate, as if the house had been frozen in time. It was on the second floor that I first noticed something odd. In what had been the master bedroom, there was a section of wall where the wallpaper was slightly discolored, not from age or sun damage, but in a pattern that looked almost like a human silhouette. When I moved closer to examine it, the temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath in the suddenly frigid air. I dismissed it as an old house quirk and continued my inspection. The third floor had been converted into an artist's studio by a previous owner, with excellent natural light from skylights and large windows. But as I took measurements, I became increasingly aware of an unsettling sensation, the feeling of being watched. I turned around several times, expecting to see Mrs. Hendricks or perhaps a curious neighbor, but I was completely alone. Yet the sensation persisted and intensified. It felt as though invisible eyes were tracking my every movement, studying me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. While photographing the studio, something in one of my pictures made me freeze. In the background of a shot showing the room's beautiful, exposed brick wall, there appeared to be a figure translucent and barely visible, but unmistakably human in shape. I checked the viewfinder and took several more photos of the same area, but the figure didn't appear again. I convinced myself it was a trick of light and shadow, perhaps combined with dust particles in the air. But as I prepared to leave, I discovered something that shattered that rationalization. In the library on the main floor, I found a collection of journals hidden behind a loose panel in one of the bookcases. The journals belonged to previous owners of the house, spanning from 1903 to 2019. Each family had left behind their own account of living in the house, and the stories were remarkably consistent. The earliest entry, dated March 15, 1903, was written by Edmund Blackwood himself. The house is magnificent, everything I dreamed it would be, yet I cannot shake the feeling that we are not alone here. Margaret insists she sees figures in the windows when she returns from town, but the servants swear no one else is in the house. A journal from 1934 describes similar experiences. The children refuse to play on the third floor. They claim there is a sad lady who watches them from the corners. We have searched every inch of that floor but found nothing. Entry after entry, decade after decade, describe the same phenomena. The sensation of being watched, unexplained temperature drops, figures seen in peripheral vision, and an overwhelming sadness that seemed to permeate the entire structure. The most recent entry was dated just 6 months earlier, written by Mrs. Hendricks. "We cannot stay any longer. The house wants something from us, something we cannot give. Last night, Sarah woke up screaming, saying the lady from upstairs was standing at the foot of her bed. We found wet footprints leading from Sarah's room to the third floor, but no one in this family had been upstairs. Tomorrow we move out. Let someone else try to appease whatever haunts this place. I should have left immediately. Every instinct told me to walk away from the listing and recommend that the owners demolish the property. But something about the house had gotten under my skin, a compulsion to understand what was happening, to solve the mystery that had defeated so many families. I began spending entire days at the property, researching its history and documenting the strange phenomena. I discovered that the house had been built on the site of a much older structure that had burned down in 1901, killing a young woman named Catherine Mills, who had been trapped on the third floor. The fire had been blamed on faulty electrical wiring, but several witnesses reported seeing Catherine at her window, calling for help, even after the stairs had collapsed and rescue was impossible. The more time I spent in the house, the more active the phenomena became. Doors would close on their own. Always when I was about to leave a room, I would hear footsteps on the floor above me, moving back and forth as if someone were pacing anxiously. The temperature drops became more frequent and more severe, sometimes causing frost to form on the windows even on warm days. But it was the dreams that finally drove me away. After spending a particularly long day at the property, I went home exhausted and fell into a deep sleep. In my dream, I was standing in the third floor studio of the house, but it wasn't the renovated space I knew. Instead, it was a young woman's bedroom, furnished with antiques from the early 1900s. Catherine Mills stood by the window, her face pressed against the glass, her mouth open in a silent scream. She turned to look at me, her eyes filled with a sadness so profound it felt like a physical weight on my chest. "I cannot leave," she said, her voice like wind through broken glass. "I have been waiting so long for someone to understand. The fire, it wasn't an accident. He locked me in. He locked me in and let me burn." I woke up gasping, my heart pounding, but the dream felt more real than reality. I could still smell smoke and see Catherine's desperate face pleading for help that never came. The next morning, I drove to the county records office and spent hours researching the 1901 fire. What I found confirmed my worst suspicions. Catherine Mills had been having an affair with Edmund Blackwood. On the night of the fire, Blackwood's wife had discovered the relationship. The fire department report mentioned that the door to Catherine's room had been found locked from the outside, with the key missing. Catherine hadn't died in an accident. She had been murdered, left to burn alive while her killer watched from the safety of the ground. And for over a century, Her spirit had been trapped in that house, reliving her final moments of terror and betrayal. I never showed the house to another client. Instead, I worked with the Hendricks family to donate the property to the local historical society, with the condition that it be converted into a memorial for Catherine Mills and other victims of domestic violence. The house still stands today, but it serves a different purpose now, not as a home for the living, but as a place where Catherine's story can finally be told. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, visitors to the memorial report seeing a figure in the third-floor window, not the desperate, terrified woman from my dreams, but a peaceful presence, finally at rest now that her truth has been acknowledged. The house no longer watches visitors with malevolent intent. Instead, it stands as a testament to the importance of speaking for those who can no longer speak for themselves. I learned that some hauntings are not about fear, but about justice. Some spirits are not trying to harm the living, but simply waiting for someone to care enough to listen to their story. Catherine Mills waited over a century for her truth to be heard. I'm honored to have been the one who finally heard her.